The kingdom had forgotten what defeat looked like. Its banners flew over mountains, deserts, forests, and coastlines once ruled by proud kings who now knelt before a single throne. Every campaign ended the same way. Every enemy eventually surrendered. Every victory added another province to an empire that seemed to have no limits. For 20 years, no army had broken the king's will. No rival had challenged his authority. No famine threatened his people. No rebellion survived longer than a few days. History had become little more than a record of his victories. The capital reflected that confidence. Massive stone walls surrounded the city like the arms of a giant protecting its greatest treasure. Marble streets stretched toward the royal palace, where fountains poured endlessly into pools carved from white granite. Merchants sold silk from distant kingdoms, gold from conquered mountains, and spices that had traveled farther than most men ever would. Children played without fear. Soldiers walked with pride. The people believed they lived in the greatest kingdom the world would ever know. And perhaps they were right. High above them all stood the palace. Its towers pierced the clouds. Its halls glittered with gold and polished marble. Paintings celebrated victories no one dared question. Statues immortalized generals whose greatest achievement had simply been serving the king. Every corridor whispered the same message. Power lived here. Each morning began with ceremony. Nobles gathered beneath towering columns to offer reports from every corner of the empire. Generals announced another peaceful surrender. Treasurers displayed overflowing chests filled with tribute. Artists unveiled portraits celebrating the king's greatness. Poets compared him to the gods. The court applauded. The king accepted it all with quiet confidence, not arrogance, certainty. After all, he had earned everything surrounding him. He had united divided lands, protected his people, expanded the kingdom beyond imagination. His name inspired loyalty among allies and fear among enemies. If history remembered greatness, surely it will remember him. And yet, when the palace finally became silent each night, the certainty disappeared. Long after servants extinguished the final torches and guards settled into their midnight watch, the king remained awake. He wandered through endless corridors where his footsteps echoed against polished stone. Sometimes he stood before enormous maps showing every land under his command. Sometimes he stared at portraits painted during younger years when victory still felt exciting. Sometimes he climbed alone to the highest balcony, overlooking the sleeping capital. Thousands of lights flickered below. An empire rested peacefully because of him, yet peace refused to enter his own mind. At first he ignored it. Every ruler grows tired, he told himself. Every great responsibility carries invisible weight, but the feeling returned. Night after night, growing stronger, growing quieter, growing impossible to escape. So he did what powerful men often do when confronted with something they cannot control. He tried to outrun it. New palaces were commissioned. Larger gardens were planted. More magnificent celebrations filled the royal calendar. Musicians arrived from distant kingdoms. Architects designed monuments unlike anything ever built. Military expeditions pushed the borders even farther. Every achievement briefly silenced the emptiness. Only briefly, because each victory lasted a little less than the one before. One evening, the palace hosted the grandest banquet in its history. Crystal chandeliers illuminated hundreds of guests. Golden goblets reflected dancing candlelight. The finest musicians in the empire filled the hall with triumphant melodies, while nobles laughed and toasted another year of prosperity. Every face looked toward the king. Every smile sought his approval. Every conversation celebrated his greatness. It should have been the happiest night of his life. Instead, something strange happened. The king looked around the magnificent hall. He saw laughter, admiration, luxury, power. But for the first time, none of it felt real. The applause sounded distant. The music felt empty. The smiles appeared rehearsed. It was as though he were watching someone else's life unfold before him. Without warning, he placed his goblet upon the table. The musicians continued playing. The guests continued laughing. No one understood why their ruler quietly rose from his seat. He walked through the enormous hall without speaking. Past generals, past ministers, past friends who had known him for decades. No one dared stop him. His footsteps echoed through the palace corridors until he reached the throne room. Moonlight poured through towering windows, bathing the empty chamber in pale silver. There it stood, the throne, forged from white marble and covered in gold, the symbol of everything he had spent his life protecting. He slowly approached it, ran his fingers across the carved armrest, then sat down. Silence filled the room. For several long minutes, he simply stared ahead. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked the empty hall a question no one had ever heard him ask. If this throne disappeared tomorrow, who would I be? The silence answered first. Then came something far more frightening. Nothing. No certainty. No confidence. No answer. The following morning, the palace awakened to quiet panic. Royal physicians examined the king from sunrise until dusk. They found no illness. The kingdom's greatest priest performed sacred rituals beneath clouds of incense. Nothing changed. Astrologers searched the heavens for hidden omens. Scholars consulted ancient manuscripts. Generals insisted another military campaign would restore the king's spirit. Every advisor offered solution. Every solution failed. Days became weeks. The king smiled less, spoke less, celebrated less. Even victory reports no longer stirred his interest. The court whispered among itself. Some feared a curse. Others suspected illness. None understood the truth, because the problem did not belong to the body. It belonged to the man beneath the crown. Finally, an old traveler arrived at the palace gates. He carried no jewels, no soldiers, no banners announcing noble blood, only a weather cloak, a walking staff, and eyes that seemed strangely untouched by either fear or admiration. The guards laughed. The ministers objected. The nobles dismissed him as another wandering philosopher hoping to gain royal favor. But the king, exhausted by answers that explained nothing, gave a single order. Bring him to me. Hours later, the great bronze doors of the throne room slowly opened. The old traveler entered without hesitation. He did not bow. He did not praise the kingdom. He did not even look at the throne. Instead, his eyes settled directly upon the king. Not the crown, not the robes. The man. The room fell completely silent, because for the first time in many years, someone had entered the palace who seemed entirely unimpressed by power. The old traveler stepped forward. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, and before speaking a single word, he simply observed the king, as though he were searching for the person hidden beneath the empire. The throne room remained silent. Morning sunlight poured through towering windows, illuminating the marble floor where kings, generals, and ambassadors had once stood trembling before the ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Now only two men occupied the room. One wore a crown. The other wore nothing that suggested power at all. The king studied the old philosopher carefully. He had expected another speech, another promise, another explanation wrapped in comforting words. Instead, Friedrich Nietzsche simply observed him. Minutes passed. Neither man spoke. The silence became almost unbearable. Finally, the king broke it. Do you know why I summoned you? Nietzsche nodded only slightly. I know why everyone else failed. The answer surprised the king. And why is that? Because they tried to heal your discomfort. Nietzsche's voice remained calm. But your discomfort is not the disease. The king frowned. For weeks, physicians had searched for illness. Priests had blamed unseen spirits. Advisors had recommended distractions. No one had spoken like this. Nietzsche slowly walked through the throne room. His eyes wandered across towering statues, jeweled banners, priceless treasures, and portraits celebrating victories that stretched back decades. He touched none of them. He admired none of them. Instead, he asked a single question. How long has it been since you walked through this palace without being called your majesty? The king hesitated. I don't remember. Nietzsche nodded. I suspected as much. The philosopher requested something unusual. He asked permission to remain inside the palace for several days. Not to advise, not to lecture, only to watch. Curious, the king agreed. Over the following days, Nietzsche followed him everywhere. He stood quietly beside council meetings. He observed military briefings. He watched servants bow before the throne. He listened while poets praised victories. He noticed how every conversation began with titles instead of names. No one addressed the king as a man, only as a ruler, even at dinner, even in private chambers, even while walking through the gardens. Every person around him spoke to the crown before speaking to the human being wearing it. On the fourth evening, Nietzsche finally requested a private walk, without soldiers, without servants, without ministers. The king reluctantly agreed. For the first time in years, he left the palace wearing an ordinary cloak. They walked unnoticed through the sleeping capital. The king expected freedom. Instead, he felt strangely uncomfortable. No one bowed. No one stepped aside. Merchants passed without recognizing him. Children ran through narrow streets without lowering their heads. An old baker accidentally brushed against his shoulder without apologizing. The king stopped walking. They don't know who I am. Nietzsche looked at him. Do they? The king remained silent. The philosopher continued walking. Eventually, they reached a quiet hill overlooking the city. Below them, thousands of lights flickered across rooftops. The empire stretched farther than either of them could see. Nietzsche spoke without turning around. You built all of this. The king answered proudly. Yes. You protected it. I did. You sacrificed your youth for it. I would do it again. Nietzsche nodded, then asked a question that would divide the king's life into two parts. If I took your crown away, the philosopher turned toward him. Who would you be? The question lingered between them. The king opened his mouth, then stopped. He searched for an answer. Warrior. No. Without the kingdom. Perhaps not. Conqueror. Only because he had possessed armies. Leader. Only because others obeyed him. Protector. Only because there had been a throne to protect. Every answer somehow returned to the crown, not to himself. Minutes passed. The king finally whispered, I don't know. Nietzsche's expression did not change. That, he said quietly, is why you cannot sleep. The wind moved gently across the hill. The city below remained unaware that its king had just admitted something he had never confessed to another living soul. Nietzsche continued, You have spent your entire life strengthening your kingdom. The king nodded, but somewhere along the way, the philosopher said, You allowed the kingdom to become stronger than the man who created it. The words struck harder than any accusation, because they felt true. The king looked back toward the palace towering above the city. For decades he believed he owned the throne. Now a frightening possibility entered his mind. Perhaps the throne had owned him all along. Nietzsche stepped beside him. Power is a magnificent servant. He paused. But it is a terrible identity. The king remained silent, because for the first time in his life, he was no longer afraid of losing his empire. He was afraid that without it, nothing of himself would remain. The city awakened as it always had. Marketplaces filled with merchants. Soldiers changed the palace guard. The royal court gathered beneath towering columns, waiting for another day of commands, victories, and decisions from a man they believed needed nothing. Nothing had changed. And yet, somehow everything had, because something had shifted, not within the kingdom, not within the palace, not within the throne itself, but within the man who had spent his entire life believing that the crown and the king were the same person. For the first time in decades, the king entered the throne room without feeling its familiar certainty. The marble floor remained untouched. The banners still hung proudly from the walls. Golden sunlight poured through stained glass windows, painting the room with the colors of power. Yet none of it felt as permanent as it once had, because once a person begins questioning the identity they have built, even the strongest walls begin to look temporary. The court bowed as he entered. Your Majesty. The words echoed through the chamber. For years they had filled him with confidence. Now they sounded strangely distant, almost as though they were spoken to someone else. Across the hall stood Friedrich Nietzsche, silent, watching, waiting. The king slowly walked toward the throne. The same throne he had defended through wars. The same throne generations had admired. The same throne he believed had given his life meaning. He reached it, placed both hands upon its armrests, and stood perfectly still. The entire court watched in silence. Then something happened that no one in the room expected. The king removed his crown. Slowly, carefully, almost reverently. He looked at it for a long moment. The jewels still reflected the morning light. It was as magnificent as ever, but for the first time, it looked like an object, not an identity. He placed it gently upon the throne. Gasps spread across the hall. Ministers exchanged frightened glances. Generals looked toward one another in confusion. Some believed the king had lost his mind. Others feared this was the beginning of disaster. But the king never looked at them. His eyes remained fixed upon the crown. Then he spoke, not to the court, not to his ministers, not even to Nietzsche. He spoke to himself. For years, I believed I was protecting this crown. A long silence followed. Then he continued. Now I see. I was protecting the fear of losing it. The words settled over the throne room with quiet force. Because everyone present suddenly understood that this conversation had never been about a kingdom. It had always been about a man. The king turned toward Nietzsche. There was no pride left in his face, only honesty. He asked one final question. If I am not my crown, then who am I? The room became perfectly still. Even the guards standing beside the great doors seemed to stop breathing. Nietzsche walked slowly toward the throne. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor. He looked at the crown, then at the king. Finally, he spoke. You have spent your life conquering kingdoms. Now you must conquer the only one that ever truly ruled you. The king frowned slightly. Nietzsche continued. Titles disappear. Empires fall. Gold changes hands. Crowns belong to history. But the person who exists beneath all of those things, he paused. That is the only kingdom worth ruling. The words settled into the silence like stones sinking into deep water. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove. The king looked one last time at the crown resting upon the throne. It had not become smaller. He had simply stopped seeing it as himself. A faint smile crossed his face. Not the smile of victory, the smile of understanding. Nietzsche turned toward the great doors of the palace. Without waiting for applause, without asking for gratitude, he began walking away. Just before stepping into the morning light, he stopped. Without turning around, he spoke one final sentence. The greatest prison is not built from stone. It is built from the identity you are afraid to lose. Then he disappeared beyond the palace doors. The court remained frozen. The ministers still searched for explanations. The generals still worried about the future. But the king no longer looked at the throne. Instead, he walked toward the palace balcony overlooking the city. For the first time in many years, he did not see an empire that belonged to him. He saw a man who finally belonged to himself. And in that moment, the richest king in the world discovered that freedom had never been waiting beyond another victory. It had been waiting beneath the crown all along.